Hi, this is Jeff Altman, the Big Game Hunter, and welcome to Job Search Radio on webtalkradio.net. This is a show where I like to spend about a half hour speaking with a guest about some element of job search because, frankly, I want to help make it a lot easier for you to find work. And my guest is Amanda Abea, a millennial career coach and life coach who's been helping millennials create better relationships with work and money since 2010. And she's the author of the Amazon bestseller, Make Money Your Honey. And her work has been featured in Forbes, the Huffington Post, the Chicago Tribune, and others. Amanda, welcome to Job Search Radio. Great to have you on.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Terrific. Amanda, millennials have gotten a very tough hand dealt to them. And at the same time, the press about millennials isn't really all that kind to them. How do they get that sort of reputation from people? And how would you most accurately describe what the reputation really is about?
Okay, well, there's a few factors that go into the, millennials being entitled. And I know when I graduated in 2010 and couldn't find a job for 6 months, that was being thrown in my face. Oh, you're entitled. You just want to take pictures of the food. You can't. You just don't want the jobs that are available to you. And I was here like, no, it's like 13% unemployment where I live. I literally can't find a job. I will take anything, but it wasn't happening. So there are a few things that kind of lead into this whole entitlement thing. And the first is that, layman's terms, we're just like totally ill-prepared when we graduate from college. So when I was a recruiter and I was recruiting for Fortune 500 companies, I would spend a lot of time interviewing millennials and consulting them in their careers. And one thing that would come off as entitled, not that they were entitled, but it would come off as such, was that they really just were completely unrealistic about what was available in the job market. They knew things were bad, but, perhaps their school or their program director had told them, oh, okay, well, you did this specific major, you're going to make $50,000 your first year out of college, take this, do this, and you're going to be fine. You'll have a job before you even get out of here. And, of course, that was not happening, not even close. So it sometimes takes a little while for them to just kind of get used to the fact that it's not what they told them in school. And that's nothing.
It's so unfortunate. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
It's so unfortunate because, frankly, with the right information that they could have received along the way, there are opportunities that they probably missed out on because they were so ill-prepared.
Yeah, and that's probably happened to every generation. I mean, this whole, school not preparing people for the real world has been around forever. It's just because of the recession, I guess millennials really saw it big time, and it took them a little while to adjust. The other theory is there's a book called The Work Revolution. I believe it's by Julie Clow, and she compares companies like Google and Zappos and the newer companies to older companies. And the reason being that companies are having a difficult time retaining millennial employees. I think we're going through a job every 2 or 3 years. I think that's what it is. We're just find a new one. The gold watch age era is done.
Very true. And that's true for everyone. When I got into recruiting many years ago, the idea that someone changed jobs every 2 years made you into a job hopper. And that's not the case anymore. Clearly,
not at all.
2 years is a long time.
Yeah, so one of the things that happens in her theory as to why perhaps this job hopping is occurring is because you have millennials, which are a giant generation. We outnumber baby boomers. We're also the most educated generation to date. But a lot of policies that companies haven't quite caught up to that yet. So a millennial goes there, isn't getting paid very well, despite the fact that they have a great education and spent thousands of dollars on a degree. They also have all these great ideas, but they're not being heard. They're not really being valued. And companies haven't necessarily learned how to deal with the millennial employees yet. So it kind of goes both ways. It's like, okay, well, millennials got handed a crappy hand, and they've had to make some serious shifts, and they're learning the hard way that it's not at all what they told them in school. But at the same time, you have certain factors that millennials bring to the table that perhaps other generations did not, and companies have not yet quite caught on to that, and that takes time.
So with that being the case, we have a generation of people who are well-educated, smart, and struggling to land or launch, depending upon how you want to look at this thing. And they've got great skills, and there's a disconnect in there. So from the millennial vantage point, and we're going to come back to the corporate vantage point a little bit later, but from the millennial perspective, what sort of adjustments, or should they make adjustments, do they need to make in order to start doing better on their interviews and actually land work?
Well, number one, you mean the adjustments from the millennials or the adjustments that the companies need to make?
Millennials.
Millennials? Okay, well, first of all, millennials need to actually research what is available to them. Oftentimes people don't realize that your salaries or even what jobs are available to you are very contingent upon where you live. You're not going to be making the same kind of money in Florida that you'll be making in New York. You may not even find the same jobs in Florida that you'll find in New York. And a lot of people actually don't know this. They have no clue. Not just millennials, just everyone. So that's number one. Do your research. Go to the Department of Labor. See what's happening. See what's going on. Go to your state's Department of Labor. See what's happening there. See what's going on. Really educate yourself. The second thing they need to learn is that they need to be, actually both need to learn this, the millennials and the companies, but the millennials need to learn that they need to be flexible. You know, they can't get stuck to a degree. They can't get, caught up on, oh, well, my school said I'm going to make this much money, so I absolutely have to make this much money, no and ifs or buts about it. And it does not work that way. It never, ever worked that way.
And most of the time the universities have no idea about what they're talking about. And
exactly, and a lot of yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. And they say a whole bunch of stuff, not realizing that in painting this rosy picture, they're actually hurting the people that they're ostensibly trying to help.
Right, and there have been universities who have gotten into trouble for inflating employment numbers for majors and inflating the salaries and things like that. But don't take your school verbatim. Do your own research. See what is available to you. And if you got to move, move. If you got to change, don't be afraid to be flexible and change. And, you're not stuck to your major. There's a bunch of different things that you can do. And just because it doesn't look a certain way doesn't mean it's not still valuable. I think that's something that millennials can definitely learn. And something we've had to learn the hard way.
And so true. And that idea of not sticking to your major, I think, is brilliant, Amanda. Because, frankly, there are ways that you can apply that knowledge from your major in ways that many people don't ostensibly think about. But if they start talking with others about what their experiences are like, I think they can really learn some alternatives where they can use the knowledge from their undergrad degree in English or in writing or in journalism, for example, and apply it in completely unconventional ways like some people I'm talking to have done.
Exactly. I was an English lit major, and I worked in recruiting, and now I run my own company coaching. Am I doing literary criticism? No, but I still use a lot of the skills I learned from my liberal arts education.
Bingo. And that's the creative approach I think is so important that millennials and, frankly, others start applying to themselves instead of using that rigid mindset that just leaves them trapped in a paradigm that just doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, be open to creative opportunities that perhaps you may have not even thought of.
Beautiful. What else can they do to try and get themselves positioned in the next organization or in their first organization?
The next thing they can do is to not get stuck by job titles. So, perhaps you were working while you were in college. You had a part-time job. You were doing a work study. You worked during the summer, whatever, right? Oftentimes when I'm coaching clients, what happens is that they're like, okay, for example, I'll use this example. They were a key holder for a giant retail company that sells cell phones, for example, right? But they were basically managing the place when the manager was not there. They were essentially an assistant manager. It did not say that per se in the title, but that's what they were doing. So what happens is when they go to the interview, they just kind of stick to the title and they don't talk about everything else they had going on and all the other skills and everything else that they learned because they think they need to stick to the title.
So in that example where they might be a salesperson or whatever, and they've at times functioned as an assistant manager, it's real important for them to mention that, because otherwise, how does the interviewer know, right?
Exactly. They're not going to know unless you tell them.
Very, very true. And there's so many examples like this I know I've run into where I'm interviewing someone. It doesn't matter whether they're relatively inexperienced or very experienced. I suddenly pick up on something within their resume, and I'll ask them, did you really manage that group? And it's not really, mentioned in the resume, and they'll go, yeah, half the time I was managing, half the time I was actually doing, but, I was the go-to person for this, and I'm going, where was that in your resume? How would I have known that unless I took a stab in the dark here? And
yeah, exactly.
It's certainly true for millennials that they have to say this kind of stuff because otherwise no one knows.
Yeah, and another thing they can do, and I interviewed a lot of millennials, and this was not the case with all of them. I mean, I honestly have to say that most of the stereotypes are not true, but there were individuals that would really embody them. Do not try and fight the recruiter or the hiring manager. If you're not right for the job, you're not right for the job. That's it. But I think that also goes back to that whole being open to other possibilities and doing your research. You may say, hey, I want $50,000 my first year, and the recruiter may say, okay, well, that's not possible. We can get you 30 to 35 as an entry-level college grad. Don't try and fight them and demand your way up to 50. They know more than you do about what's going on in the market.
You're not going to get it because the reason they're talking about 30 to 35 is because that's where the market is for you, 30 to 35.
Yeah, pretty much. So, that did not happen with everyone, but I did see it happen a few times, and that's when I was like, that's where the stereotype comes from.
Oh, my. Folks, you're listening to Amanda Bea, and we're going to be back with her in just a moment. This is Jeff Altman, the Big Game Hunter, and you're listening to Job Search Radio on webtalkradio.net. We're going to go into my Job Search Insider tip now, and then we're going to come back to Amanda in just a moment. And my tip is about resumes, because although I've done a couple of shows already about them, and I suspect I'm going to do some more shows in the not-too-distant future, there's some points that haven't been covered yet that I want to make sure that you hear loud and clear. And first of all, font matters. Pick a simple font. Avoid the Times New Roman font. No one cares about it. It's bland and it's ugly. Size it at least 10 to 12 points, but skip Times New Roman. Next, avoid references, personal info, and pictures. There's no need to include references on your resume or include the phrase, references are available upon request. We know they're available upon request. And the picture, well, in some cultures, pictures are appropriate. In U.S. culture, it really isn't. And you don't need to reference your age, religion, or marital status. Next, tailor your resume to the job you're applying for. If you don't, it's like the broken watch that's right twice a day. It's going to be right on occasion, but most of the time, it really isn't. And finally, proofread, and then proofread it again. When you're proofreading, I know the standard way is to start at the top and go to the end. I found that there's so many errors that I see toward the back end of the resume where people get a little bit lazier. Start at the last sentence and work your way back up to the top. I found by doing it that way, I see a lot fewer mistakes, and people pick up on those mistakes. It will hurt you, and you will miss out on opportunities unless it's proofread properly. So that's my tip for this time. Let's come back to Amanda. You've given us some great advice so far, and we always have limited amounts of time, unfortunately. I want to make sure we cover as many points as you have available. What's the next thing that they need to do in order to help themselves find work?
Well, one thing they can do, and one thing that has really become a trend in this generation, is if you can't necessarily find a job off the bat, there's no reason why you can't create your own job. Oftentimes, people who have not been able to find work, not just millennials, but we've seen it in other generations in most recent years, they create their own jobs, they create their own companies, and then they use that as a springboard to get a traditional job if that is what they actually want to do. So there's no reason why you can't create your own job and then use that as work experience.
And I know some folks who might hear that idea of create your own job, create your own company, might get a little intimidated by that idea. Me create a company? We're not obviously talking about the famous companies out there that were really started by people doing much the same thing as you're advocating for. But some folks do get scared. How do you overcome that fear and actually step out there? And what sort of work can you recommend that people might try starting out?
Well, the first thing is to realize, and actually I went to a networking event yesterday where this came up, that when it comes to businesses, oftentimes people don't realize that if they are trading dollars for something, even if it's just a few dollars, you are technically legally a business. You don't need to make that much on your own in order to get taxed for it and be considered a business by the IRS.
Oh, yeah.
But oftentimes people don't know that. So just to realize that even if you're just trading a few dollars, you are a business. You are a business. You are legally, and according to the IRS, a business. Even if it doesn't look fancy, even if it doesn't look a certain way. The other thing they can do is to go online. People can start businesses from their living rooms as long as you have an internet connection. For example, I've worked with a lot of freelance writers, web designers, copy editors, consultants. Take whatever skills you have and apply it to an online world. Or you could even go around the neighborhood. I have a neighbor, and what he did was he just started walking everyone's dogs, and he ended up building his own company because he loved dogs,
Mm-hmm.
So it really is that simple, and oftentimes people don't realize that what they love and the skills that they have, they can actually make money doing it, and that just requires a mental shift.
And I know there are sites like Elance and Odesk and Guru and a host of others where people are able to find work globally. There are folks that I've hired, I know, from Fiverr and fiverr.com to do quick, inexpensive tasks for me. And it doesn't sound like much to make $5, and obviously it isn't. But if it takes you 5 minutes to do it, and then you can go off and work on other things, why not?
Exactly. And either way, like let's say they use that to eventually go into traditional employment, it's not a bad idea to have an extra source of income. It's never a bad idea. So the earlier you start, the better. You're building an asset for yourself. In many ways, if you build a side business, you're recession-proofing your career. If that traditional job doesn't work out, because we never know what's going to happen with the market, you have something to fall back on. And it's something that you built slowly over time.
And as a number of my guests have pointed out over the course of previous weeks, there's no such thing as a permanent job anymore. There's a full-time job, but the idea of a permanent position just doesn't exist. So you have to do things to protect yourself financially. And setting up something like you're suggesting, Amanda, is a great idea.
Yeah, it's always smart to have like different sources of income coming in, especially in a time where it's not even that there's no such thing as a permanent job. It's just there's really no such thing as certainty. And it sounds really scary, but when I think it was Benjamin Franklin who said the only certainties in life are death and taxes. It's true. So you kind of have to get prepared. And at least taxes, you know when you're going to be paying them.
Unless you file an extension, of course.
Of course, yes.
And I put off the idea about the bias companies have toward millennials. And maybe what we could do is pull together the biases that companies have with how millennials might be able to overcome some of those biases. You willing to work on that with me?
Yeah, sure. Let's talk about it.
Great. So what sort of biases do companies express toward millennials in their hiring, and how can they overcome that?
Well, a lot of it usually just goes back to they're totally unrealistic and have no idea how the business world works. And, that's typically true if you've been in school your entire life. And that just goes back to the research. It just goes back to the research. Another thing, and actually this is interesting because this is both a complaint that millennials have about the companies and that companies have about millennials. It's just from different perspectives, and that's the idea of flexibility. So one thing that we're seeing, which is huge, for example, is that millennials, I mean, thanks to the internet, oftentimes we don't even have to show up to an office. So when the recession happened, it really kind of changed the way that the world started thinking about work and money, particularly that generation that was coming of age and perhaps saw their parents being laid off after 30 years and things like that. So millennials started to question, okay, what's the point? Like, why am I going to work for a company for 30 years if they're going to lay me off? Why am I going to work so hard when I can just do it for myself? And all these thoughts started happening. So one thing that a millennial can do is to realize that there is still value in traditional work, and that there are still good companies out there, and that there are companies who want them, and it's just a matter of finding them. Now, in terms of the companies complain that the millennials are not flexible because of, it just goes back to that unrealistic thing, that they don't really know what they're getting themselves into. So do your research, get out there. The earlier you start working, the better. If you can get a job even before you graduate college, that's going to help you so much when you do graduate and have to go into this new world of work.
And that goes back to an interview I did with Dr. Markel Quarles from Arkansas State not too long ago, where he was speaking to students and saying, from the time you get into school, don't wait till your senior year to start talking with advisors and with faculty. Start right as soon as you get in. Start to build those relationships as soon as possible in order to ensure that they know you and they're able to recommend you. And I'm not talking about just simply providing a reference, but I mean legitimately recommend you, because the faculty is often out and about.
Right. Get yourself summer jobs, internships, preferably those that pay, because that will help later on when it comes to determining your salary. Part-time jobs, work study, all of that stuff, you can do it while you're in school. Even part-time jobs go a very long way once you graduate and have to enter this real world and start interviewing with organizations.
Very true.
Any experience is work experience.
Right. I remember a cousin of mine who worked at a law firm during her summers and eventually was hired by that firm on graduation. Another cousin who was the salesperson at the pool place and ultimately got hired as a salesperson upon graduation. That's what he wanted to do with his life. He wanted to sell. God bless him. And folks, you could be doing the same thing as well. Planting the seeds so that at graduation you already have some experience and can stand out from your competition. So what else do employers do? And what other biases do they have toward millennials, and how can they get past them?
One that we used to deal with a lot in recruiting, and I did see it a few times with how millennials would react to it, was the idea that millennials wanted to move up very quickly. So they're like, okay, within a year I'm going to be a manager, again, because this is probably what they told them in school, and they didn't research and they don't really know because this is their first experience out in this world. There was a time when companies would do that. You had like management trainee programs and you get bumped up every 6 months. Some of these programs still exist, but they're harder to get into. But for the most part, it's not necessarily like that anymore. And ultimately what we have to realize, millennials and everyone really, is that the way things used to be before the recession, we're not going back there.
No, we aren't. Things are completely different in corporate world. Oh, good advice, Amanda. Good advice.
Yeah,
and
so the sooner you can – oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No,
I was going to say the sooner you can comprehend that and understand that, the easier your life is going to become, because you're not – it goes back to that, rigid way of seeing how things used to be. Let go of how things used to be. They're not going to happen again, and instead embrace this new world of work. Yes, there are a lot of struggles and there are going to be hurdles, but there's also a lot of opportunity that we didn't have before. Companies are putting in slowly, but they're putting in new initiatives for this new generation coming in so that they can retain them. You have people starting businesses more than we've seen in decades. So there's a lot of opportunity that comes, and there's a lot of creative solutions to many of the problems that we're facing in terms of the economy and finding a job and, being able to work your way up. But we have to let go of that idea that things are going to go back to the way that they were before. We have to let it go.
And thus, for a millennial who's graduating without information, or without good information, I should say, how do they go about getting the right information before they spend 6 months or a year looking for work?
Well, you could go to the Department of Labor, particularly in the state, because then you're going to see what's going on locally, and that'll give you a better picture of what's going on nationally. Because, nationally they're doing the average of everywhere, really, and as we discussed earlier, a lot of times your salary and what is available to you will depend on where you live. The other thing they can do is informational interviews are great. So what informational interviews are essentially you set up the interview with an individual who's working in a field that you want, right? And instead of you being interviewed for a job, you are essentially interviewing them and trying to get information and research on what it is like to do that job and what it takes to get there. And that's gold. It's tremendous. And oftentimes all you got to do is send an email and be like, hey, look, I'm a college kid looking into this field. I really admire what you do. Flatter them, I want to invite you out to coffee, and I'm really looking into this, and I was wondering if you could kind of help me and give me an idea of what this field is like, what I need to do to get in there, all that kind of stuff. And usually people just go for it. They love helping the young kids out, so flatter them.
Very true. And I have the idea that alumni groups can be a way that a graduate can go about this. That often the alum are very willing to do this to help out the recent grads because they've been in the same seat at the same university. And as long as the millennial can tolerate some of the stupid questions that they get asked about the school, by the alumni, it can be a great experience.
Right, just go straight to the horse's mouth. Instead of Googling it, because who knows how old some of that information is or where they got it from, just go straight to the people who are working there. And that really applies for anything because even, if you've been with an organization for a while, if you're going to move up or if you're going to move in another direction, oftentimes it's who you know. And oftentimes, that's where you're going to get the information you need by people who are already there, just, doing it for yourself.
And one of the fun things is, although at the end you are not saying, hey, can you hire me? Or do you know any jobs that are here? You're planting a seed in someone's mind that if they're working in that firm, in that industry that you're considering, and something does open up, they may reach back to you. And they may bring you in for the interview.
Yeah, absolutely. Hit them up on LinkedIn. Put a tag. Start organizing these people. These are the ones I've done informational interviews with. Stay in contact with them. Just say, hey, just checking in, see what's going on. And you really, really never know. And oftentimes, one thing that we would see in recruiting, and oftentimes I see it now as a coach, whether they're working in traditional jobs or whether they're entrepreneurs, oftentimes people don't realize that there's so much opportunity from talking to people. So, for example, they really, the fear of networking, people need to get over that, So go to events that you actually like, especially for millennials. There are so many great groups that are popping up for millennials. Just go to meetup.com. Label League is a great one. Femfessionals is also wonderful. They have
Could you repeat those again? I know Meetup, of course. What were the other two?
Yeah. Meetup, you can do the Labo League, which is for women, and they have different chapters in the area, and that's for millennial women particularly. Femfessionals is also wonderful. You have Under 30 CEO that they do meetups. You can find Facebook groups of people who are in the field where you want to work, of young people who are in the field, and get to know people. Go out to these events, meet people, have fun, mingle, learn, soak everything up like a sponge, because you honestly never know. You can't only rely on sending in your application through a website and then hoping that they get it.
Not only hoping they get it, that actually someone who understands what they're looking at is going to read it.
Yeah, that too.
Normally it's the least experienced person in the department who's screening resumes, and they don't know what they're looking at.
Or they have computer glitches, or there's thousands of them coming in at once, or or another thing that happens is these companies have so many applicants that they just outsource it to someone else who doesn't even work for the company. So you can't really rely on these things entirely. You have to be a little bit more proactive. And one of the best ways to be proactive is to go out there and meet people.
Very true. One last big tip, because we're starting to come up on time. Do you have one more for the audience that you might be willing to share?
I think the biggest one, and I know we already said this, but just to really, really drive it home, is to just let go of the form, let go of what it's supposed to look like, let go of, what you've been told in school, let go of your degree even if you have to, and just really be open to everything that's out there. And the reason I say this is because we get so stressed and so caught up on what something is supposed to look like that we completely block ourselves from seeing perhaps an opportunity that's 10 to 100 times better. Because we were so fixed on the form, we totally missed it. Completely, utterly, entirely missed it. This doesn't mean that you have to throw everything out the window and you have to throw all your skills out the window. And I guess this is the point that I'm trying to make is, we're not telling you to just forget everything you learned in school or forget your degree or not go to school at all, But what we're telling you is to be flexible, be creative, be open to possibilities that you may not have even thought of yourself. And you will be surprised on how you can use those skills in that field.
And to use myself as an example, I graduated with an undergrad in political science, which of course made me qualified these days to be a barrister, maybe. Maybe.
Or an
maybe
intern.
You'd just be working or a register. I stumbled into recruiting. Eventually, I decided to go for a master's in social work, became a practicing therapist for a number of years, decided that really wasn't what I wanted to do, and returned wholeheartedly into recruiting and used many of those skills that I learned in a variety of different venues, like my master's, in order to be a far more effective recruiter for both individuals and for my corporate clients.
Yeah.
Am I a therapist now? Of course not. But I'm a therapist in many respects, working with people to help them overcome their insecurities.
Exactly. I used to joke around when I worked in recruiting that oftentimes people confuse me for their therapist, which you should not do at a job interview, by the way. But now as a coach, there's more leeway, there's more room for me to get to know someone. It's not so much me telling them what to do, it's them knowing the answers for themselves and me helping them get there. And people are much more open when you do that. And all the skills that I learned, I went to liberal arts school, so I was doing philosophy, history, humanities, literature. I was almost a political science minor. And these skills have come in ways that I could not have even imagined, because all of that just taught me how to deal with people. And that's huge. And I know we're getting a little bit off topic, but those of you who did study liberal arts or humanities and things like that, don't think that you're done. You've got two examples on this call right now of people who've been able to make it, both in traditional work and in their own companies and practices and things like that. And the reason is because we know how to deal with people, and our education gave us a really good backbone for that.
You have closed perfectly, Amanda. Thank you. How can folks reach you, and what sort of work do you do to help people?
Okay, well, as I mentioned, I am a career and life coach for millennials. So I work with those trying to get into traditional work, as well as those who feel, okay, traditional work is not my spiel. I really just want to run my own company. So I do both. And basically what I do is that I help people remove whatever blocks are in their way of really pursuing their life's work, whether it's traditional work or not. They can find me on AmandaAbeya.com. Abeya is spelled A-B as in boy, E-L-L-A. Twitter and Facebook are just my name. And you can find my book and get a pretty good introduction into who I am and what I do. You can find it on Amazon. It's called Make Money Your Honey.
Beautiful. Amanda, thank you. This has been terrific. And folks, I'll be back next time with someone else and speaking about some different element of job search. I'm Jeff Altman, the Big Game Hunter, and I have a lot more content that's available at my website, which is thebiggamehunter.us. I have my videos for YouTube, information about my books and guides, the job search, my coaching program, podcasts of this show and my other one. There's a lot of great content that's available to you at thebiggamehunter.us. So come over to the website and go exploring. I also want to mention to you that if you have questions about job hunting, I'm a live person job search and career coaching expert. So you can reach out to me through liveperson.com. I'd be very happy to answer your questions. And finally, if you'd like me to get a copy of your resume, or if you're trying to hire someone, also reach out to me. My email address is jeffaltman@thebiggamehunter.us, and you'll